Some stories don't begin with a choice. They begin with a moment you can't take back, a wrong turn, a door you shouldn't have knocked on, a second where fear moves faster than thought, and once that moment happens, nothing stays hidden for long. This is a work of fiction. All characters and events are imagined. Any danger you hear is implied, not shown. And this story is told for emotional experience, not instruction. Now listen carefully, because some doors don't just open rooms. They open consequences. She knocked on the wrong door at 3 a.m. That's what Mira would tell herself later, when the fear finally subsided enough for her to think clearly. A simple mistake. Wrong floor, wrong number, wrong everything. She'd been too panicked to check the brass numbers twice, too desperate to care that the hallway carpet on the 12th floor was darker than the one she remembered from her friend's building. All she knew was that Rosa had said apartment 12C, and that if Mira didn't get inside somewhere safe in the next 60 seconds, the men following her would find her first. So she knocked, 3 times, sharp and urgent, her knuckles stinging against the heavy wood. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her ribs aching from where Marco had shoved her against the car. The elevator chimed somewhere down the hall. Footsteps echoed in the stairwell. The door opened, shoulders that filled the door frame. Dark hair, slightly mussed, as if he'd been awake but not dressed for company. A white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled to his forearms, and his eyes, cold, assessing, the kind of gray that looked silver in certain light. Fixed on her with an intensity that made her forget, just for a second, why she was running. He didn't speak, neither did she. The footsteps in the stairwell grew louder. Mira's voice cracked when she finally found it. "Please." His gaze dropped, to her split lip, to the bruise forming along her jaw, to the way she was holding her left arm too carefully against the ribs. Then he looked past her, down the hallway, and something in his expression shifted, not softer, colder. "Inside," he said. One word. Calm. Absolute. Mira hesitated. Every instinct she'd honed over the last 3 years screamed at her not to trust men who looked like him. Men who moved with that kind of controlled stillness. Men whose homes were on the top floors of buildings that required security clearance just to reach the elevator. But the stairwell door banged open, and Marco's voice echoed down the hall. "I know you're up here, Mira. Don't make this harder." The man in the doorway didn't move, didn't look away from her, just waited, patient as stone, for her to choose. Mira stepped inside. He closed the door behind her without a sound. No lock clicking, no chain sliding into place. Just silence, thick and absolute, and as if the door itself understood the need for discretion. The apartment was dark, except for a single lamp in what looked like a study. Minimalist, expensive. The kind of space that didn't need decoration because everything in it cost more than most people made in a year. Mira pressed herself against the wall beside the door, heart hammering so loud she was sure he could hear it. Outside, Marco's footsteps slowed, stopped, knocked. 3 times, harder than she had. The man, her unexpected sanctuary, didn't even glance at the door. He stood in the center of the room, hands loose at his sides, watching her the way a predator watches prey that stumbled into its den. "The Mafia Boss," Marco called through the door. "I know you're in there. Open up." Mira's blood turned to ice. The Mafia Boss. She'd knocked on the Mafia Boss's door, the man who owned half the city's underground, the man whose name people whispered in the same breath as death, the man who'd built an empire on fear and loyalty in equal measure. She'd run from one monster straight into the arms of another. Marco knocked again. "I'm looking for someone. A woman. She's—" The Mafia Boss moved. Mira flinched, but he stopped just out of reach, close enough that she could smell expensive cologne and something darker. Smoke, maybe, or the memory of it. "Do you want me to answer that door?" he asked quietly. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of calm that came from absolute certainty. Not a threat, a question. As if her answer actually mattered. Mira shook her head. The Mafia Boss held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned, walked to the door, and opened it. Marco stood in the hallway, flanked by 2 men Mira didn't recognize. His expression shifted from impatient to uneasy the moment he saw who'd answered. "Moretti," Marco said, forcing confidence into his tone. Sorry to bother you. I'm looking for... No one's here, the Mafia boss said. 2 words. Final. Marco hesitated. She came up here. I saw her. You saw wrong. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mira could see Marco weighing his options. Push harder and risk insulting a man who could end him with a phone call, or back down and lose the woman he'd been chasing for 3 hours. He chose survival. My mistake, Marco muttered. Won't happen again. The Mafia boss didn't respond. He just closed the door and locked it this time, the sound of the deadbolt sliding home somehow louder than Marco's retreating footsteps. When he turned back to her, Mira was trembling. From the delayed shock of realizing she'd just gambled her life on a stranger's mercy. And won. Thank you, she whispered. The Mafia boss studied her for a long moment. Then he walked past her, toward the kitchen. Sit down before you fall down. It wasn't a suggestion. Mira's legs gave out before she could argue, and she found herself sinking onto the leather couch that probably cost more than her entire year's rent. Her ribs screamed in protest. Her vision blurred at the edges. The Mafia boss returned with a glass of water and a first aid kit that looked far too well stocked for someone who supposedly lived alone. He set both on the coffee table. Didn't sit, just stood there, waiting. Who was that? He asked. Mira's hands shook as she reached for the water. Someone I used to work for. And now? Now I'm someone he wants dead. The words hung in the air between them, too honest, too raw. Mira didn't know why she'd said it. Maybe because he'd already saved her once. Maybe because lying to a man like the Mafia boss felt more dangerous than telling the truth. The Mafia boss's expression didn't change. Why? Mira looked down at the water in her hands. Because I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. He was silent for so long that she finally looked up, expecting to see judgment or suspicion, or the cold calculation of a man deciding whether she was worth the trouble she'd brought to his door. Instead, she saw recognition, as if he knew exactly what it felt like to be hunted for knowing too much. What's your name? He asked. Mira. Mira, he repeated, as if testing the weight of it. You picked the wrong door. She almost laughed. Almost. I know, but you're not leaving. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a command. It was something in between. An observation that felt like a choice being made without her input. Mira's throat tightened. I can't stay here. Why not? Because... She gestured helplessly at the door, at the apartment, at him. Because you're the Mafia boss. Something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or something darker. And that's supposed to scare you more than the man who just tried to kill you? Mira met his gaze, held it. Yes. For the first time since she'd knocked on his door, the Mafia boss smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Smart, he said quietly. But you're bleeding on my couch. So we'll deal with the fear later. He opened the first aid kit, and Mira realized with a clarity that made her chest ache. She'd just traded one cage for another. The only question was which one would kill her first. The Mafia boss knew how to read people. It was a skill he'd learned young, back when reading a room correctly meant surviving another day, back when his father's moods shifted like storms and violence arrived without warning. By the time he was 16, he could tell who was lying, who was loyal, and who would sell him out for the right price, all from the way they held their shoulders. The woman bleeding on his couch, Mira, was terrified. But not of him, not entirely. She was afraid of what he represented, of the power that opened doors and closed caskets with equal efficiency. But when he'd stood close enough to smell the fear on her skin, she hadn't flinched the way people usually did. She'd held his gaze like someone who'd already survived worse than him. That made her dangerous, or interesting. He hadn't decided which yet. The Mafia boss knelt in front of her, first aid kit open on the coffee table. She'd pulled her knees up defensively, arms wrapped around her ribs, making herself smaller. The split on her lip had stopped bleeding, but the bruise along her jaw was darkening. Let me see, he said. Mira shook her head. I'm fine. You're not. I can take care of myself. The mafia boss sat back on his heels, studying her. If that were true, he said, you wouldn't have knocked on my door. Her eyes flashed. Anger, not fear. Good. Anger he could work with. I knocked on the wrong door, she said tightly. I was looking for 12C, my friend's apartment. This is 22C. Her face fell. The anger drained out of her so quickly it was almost painful to watch. 10 floors off, she whispered. I was 10 floors off. The mafia boss didn't tell her that it didn't matter. That even if she'd found the right apartment, Marco would have followed. That men like Marco didn't give up just because a woman ran up a few flights of stairs. Instead, he reached for the antiseptic. Your ribs, he said. How bad? Mira pressed her lips together. Didn't answer. The mafia boss waited. Patience was another skill he'd mastered young. His father had been impulsive, reactive, ruled by emotion. The mafia boss had learned to be the opposite. To wait, to watch, to let silence do the work that violence couldn't. Finally, Mira exhaled. I think one's cracked, she said. Maybe two. Hospital? No. Her voice was sharp, final. No hospitals, no police, no records. The mafia boss nodded once. He understood that language. The language of people who couldn't afford to be found. Then you'll stay here tonight. I can't. You can't leave, he said, his voice level, matter of fact. Marco knows you came to this floor. He'll be watching the exits, the cameras. He'll wait. Mira's hands tightened into fists. So I'm trapped. You're protected, the mafia boss corrected. There's a difference. She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Is there? She said. Because from where I'm sitting, both feel like cages. The mafia boss set the antiseptic down, leaned forward just enough that she'd have to look at him. The difference, he said quietly, is that you can leave my cage whenever you want. You just won't survive long outside it. Their eyes met, held. Mira was the first to look away. Why are you helping me? Good question. The mafia boss had asked himself the same thing the moment he'd opened the door and seen her standing there. Bleeding, desperate, clearly running from something that had teeth. He should have closed the door, should have let Marco take her, should have stayed out of whatever mess she'd dragged to his doorstep at 3 a.m. But then she'd looked at him with those wide, dark eyes. Not pleading, not begging, just asking. And something in his chest had shifted. I don't know, he said honestly. Mira blinked. Whatever answer she'd expected, it wasn't that. The mafia boss picked up a clean cloth and dampened it with antiseptic. But you're here now, he said. So we deal with that first. He reached for her face, slow enough that she could pull away if she wanted. She didn't. She just closed her eyes as he pressed the cloth gently against the split in her lip. She flinched, but didn't pull back. Tell me about Marco, the mafia boss said quietly. Mira's eyes opened. Why? Because if he's coming back, he said, I need to know what I'm dealing with. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, he works for Vincent Calabresi. The mafia boss's hand stilled. Vincent Calabresi, loan shark, extortionist. The kind of man who made his money bleeding people dry one payment at a time. The mafia boss had stayed out of Calabresi's territory for years. Not out of fear, but out of a mutual understanding that certain boundaries were better left uncrossed. Until tonight. And you? The mafia boss asked. I was his accountant, Mira said. Until I found out what he was really doing with the money. The mafia boss resumed cleaning her lip, his movements careful, methodical. What was he doing? Mira's jaw tightened. Laundering through charities, children's hospitals, homeless shelters, places people trust, places that can't afford audits. The mafia boss's respect for her went up a notch. Not many people would risk their lives over financial fraud. Most would have taken the money and looked the other way. You told someone, he said. I tried to quit, Mira said. Vincent said no one quits. Marco said if I talked, he'd make sure I disappeared. She paused. I talked anyway. To who? A federal agent, someone I thought I could trust. Her voice cracked. He was on Vincent's payroll. The mafia boss set the cloth down, sat back, looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a woman running from danger, but someone who'd tried to do the right thing and nearly died for it. That made her more than interesting. That made her worth protecting. You can stay, he said, as long as you need. Mira's eyes widened. Why would you do that? The mafia boss stood, gathering the first aid supplies. Because Vincent Calabresi is a parasite, he said. And I don't like parasites. It was only half the truth. The other half, the part he didn't say out loud, was that when she'd knocked on his door, something had shifted in the carefully ordered world he'd built around himself. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. And the mafia boss hadn't felt hope in a very long time. Guest room is down the hall, he said. Second door on the left. You'll find clothes in the closet. Take what you need. Mira stood slowly, wincing. Thank you. The mafia boss nodded, watched her walk toward the hallway, one hand pressed against her ribs. She stopped at the door, turned back. The mafia boss? He looked up. If Marco comes back, she said quietly, don't let him take me. It wasn't a request. It was a plea wrapped in the last shred of dignity she had left. The mafia boss held her gaze. He won't. 2 words, a promise he intended to keep. Because when the mafia boss made a promise, the only thing that broke it was death. And even then, he'd find a way. Forgot why every breath sent sharp pain through her ribs. Forgot that she'd spent the last month sleeping in her car, moving every night, terrified that Marco would find her before she could disappear completely. Then reality crashed back. She was in the mafia boss's apartment. She'd knocked on a mafia boss's door at 3 a.m, bled on his couch, and somehow convinced him to let her stay. Or maybe he'd convinced her. She still wasn't sure which. Mira sat up slowly, testing her ribs. Still painful, but the sharp stabbing had dulled to a constant ache. The guest room was minimalist but elegant. Cream walls, dark wood furniture, a bed so comfortable she'd fallen asleep within seconds despite everything. Someone had left clothes folded on the chair. A soft gray sweater, black pants that would probably be too long but had a drawstring waist. Clean socks? It felt surreal, domestic, as if she were a guest, not a fugitive hiding in a stranger's home. Mira dressed quickly, wincing as the sweater pulled against her bruised ribs. The pants were indeed too long, but she rolled them at the ankles and tried not to think about who they'd belonged to before her. When she emerged from the guest room, the apartment looked different in daylight. Less intimidating. The walls were painted in muted tones, grays and blues, and the furniture, while expensive, wasn't ostentatious. No gold fixtures, no marble statues, just clean lines and careful restraint. The mafia boss stood in the kitchen, back to her, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He'd changed into a different shirt, black this time, sleeves still rolled to his forearms, and his hair was damp, as if he'd recently showered. He didn't turn around when she entered. How are the ribs? Mira stopped at the edge of the kitchen. Better. Thank you for the clothes. They're yours. He handed her a mug, black coffee, no sugar. I had someone bring them this morning. Mira blinked. You had someone... She stopped, looked down at the perfectly fitting clothes. How did you know my size? The mafia boss's lips quirked, almost a smile. I'm observant. It should have been creepy, should have set off every alarm bell she'd carefully calibrated over the last 3 years. But something about the way he said it, casual, matter of fact, as if noticing details was just what he did, made it feel less like surveillance and more like care, which was somehow more dangerous. I can't stay here, Mira said. Marco left the city this morning, the mafia boss interrupted. He won't be coming back. Mira's heart stuttered. How do you know that? The mafia boss sipped his coffee. Didn't answer. He didn't need to. Mira set her mug down carefully. What did you do? I made a phone call. To who? Someone Marco fears more than he wants you dead. The implication hung in the air between them. The mafia boss had used his power, the very thing that made him dangerous, to protect her. One phone call, one exertion of influence, and Marco, who'd chased her for months, had simply left. Mira didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. "Thank you," she said quietly. The mafia boss's gaze was steady, unreadable. "Don't thank me yet." "Why not?" "Because Vincent Calabrese doesn't strike me as the type to give up just because one of his dogs got called off." Mira's stomach dropped. "You think he'll send someone else?" "I think he'll wait. Watch. Try to figure out why I'm protecting you." The mafia boss set his mug down. "Which means you can't leave yet." There it was again, the cage disguised as protection. Mira crossed her arms. "And if I want to leave anyway?" The mafia boss's expression didn't change. "Then I won't stop you." She searched his face for the lie, for the threat hidden beneath calm words. Found nothing. He meant it, which made it worse. "How long?" she asked. "Until Vincent makes his move, or until you have somewhere safer to go." Mira laughed bitterly. "Nowhere's safer than this." "Then you stay." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she didn't need his protection, that she'd survived 3 years on her own and could survive 3 more. But the truth was, she was tired. Tired of running. Tired of sleeping in her car. Tired of looking over her shoulder every time she heard footsteps. And for the first time in months, she felt something that terrified her more than danger. Safety. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stay." The mafia boss nodded once, as if he'd expected nothing less. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. His jaw tightened. "What is it?" Mira asked. The mafia boss looked up. His eyes had gone cold. "Vincent Calabrese just requested a meeting." Mira's blood turned to ice. "With you?" "With both of us." The room seemed to tilt. Vincent knew she was here, had known all along, and now he was coming to collect. Mira's voice shook. "What do we do?" The mafia boss's expression was unreadable. "We prepare." "For what?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not fear, certainty. "War," the mafia boss said quietly. Because Vincent Calabrese had just made a critical mistake. He'd threatened something the mafia boss had decided to protect. And in the mafia boss's world, that was a line you crossed only once. The meeting was set for neutral ground, a restaurant the mafia boss owned in the financial district, closed to the public but open for occasions like this. Occasions where men with blood on their hands sat across tables and pretended civility mattered more than survival. Mira didn't want to go. But the mafia boss had been clear. Vincent had asked for her specifically. Refusing would be seen as weakness. And weakness, in this world, was a death sentence written in invisible ink. So she went. The mafia boss's driver, a silent man with watchful eyes and scarred knuckles, picked them up at dawn. The city was still waking, streets empty except for delivery trucks and the occasional taxi. Mira sat in the back seat, hands folded in her lap to hide the trembling. The mafia boss sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, far enough that she didn't feel trapped. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. Mira looked at him. "You said refusing would—" "I'll handle Vincent," the mafia boss interrupted. "You can stay in the car. No one will think less of you." She wanted to take the out, wanted to hide in the safety of his protection and let him fight her battles. But that wasn't who she was. She'd spent 3 years running, 3 years letting fear dictate every decision. If she hid now, she'd spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, wondering when Vincent would come back. "I'm going," she said. The mafia boss studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Stay close to me." The restaurant was exactly what Mira expected. Understated elegance hiding brutal power, dark wood, low lighting, tables set too far apart for conversations to be overheard. The staff moved like shadows, present but invisible. Vincent Calabrese sat at a corner table, flanked by two men who looked like they'd been hired for intimidation rather than intelligence. He was older than Mira remembered, mid-50s, silver at his temples, expensive suit that couldn't hide the predator underneath. He smiled when he saw her, the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. "Mira," Vincent said warmly, as if they were old friends. "You're looking well. Better than expected, considering." Mira said nothing, just took the seat the Mafia boss pulled out for her, grateful when he sat between her and Vincent. "Moretti," Vincent continued, turning his attention to the Mafia boss. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I know we've kept our distance over the years." "You requested this meeting," the Mafia boss said. "So talk." Vincent's smile didn't falter. "Straight to business. I respect that." He leaned forward. "Mira worked for me. She knows things, sensitive things, that could cause problems if shared with the wrong people." "She's already shared them," the Mafia boss replied. "With a federal agent." Vincent waved a hand dismissively. "That's been handled. The agent in question has reconsidered his testimony." Mira's stomach turned. Reconsidered, which meant threatened, or bribed, or worse. "Then why are we here?" the Mafia boss asked. Vincent's expression hardened. "Because she's a loose end, and I don't leave loose ends." The restaurant went very quiet. The Mafia boss didn't move, didn't react, just looked at Vincent with the kind of stillness that preceded violence. "She's under my protection," the Mafia boss said. "That makes her off limits." Vincent laughed. Actually laughed. "Your protection? For an accountant?" "Yes." "Why?" The Mafia boss's gaze was steady, unblinking. "Because I decided she was." The simplicity of the statement was devastating. No justification, no explanation, just raw, undeniable authority. Vincent's smile faded. "You're making a mistake, Moretti." "Maybe," the Mafia boss replied, "but it's mine to make." Vincent stood. His men stood with him, hands moving toward concealed weapons. Mira's heart stopped, but the Mafia boss remained seated, calm, as if three armed men didn't pose a threat worth acknowledging. "Think carefully, Vincent," the Mafia boss said quietly. "You came to my restaurant, asked for this meeting. And now you're threatening someone under my roof." He paused. "Do you really want to start a war over an accountant?" Vincent's jaw tightened. He was weighing options, calculating odds, trying to decide if his pride was worth more than his survival. Finally, he smiled again, cold, empty. "This isn't over, Moretti." "It is," the Mafia boss replied. "You just don't know it yet." Vincent left without another word, his men trailing behind like trained dogs. When they were gone, Mira exhaled shakily. "He's going to come after me." "Yes," the Mafia boss said, "but not directly." "How do you know?" "Because he's smart enough to know that touching you now would mean declaring war on me. And Vincent's not ready for that war." Mira turned to look at him. "But you are." The Mafia boss met her gaze. "I've been ready for years." She believed him, and that terrified her more than anything Vincent could do. Because the Mafia boss wasn't protecting her out of kindness or obligation. He was protecting her because he'd claimed her, and men like the Mafia boss didn't let go of what they claimed, ever. 2 weeks passed. Vincent didn't come back. Marco stayed wherever the Mafia boss had sent him. The federal agent who'd been on Vincent's payroll suddenly retired, citing health reasons. Mira should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt trapped by a different kind of danger. She'd stopped sleeping in the guest room after the first week. Not because the Mafia boss asked, not because anything had happened, but because late one night she'd woken from a nightmare, Marco's hands around her throat, Vincent's cold smile, and found herself walking down the hall to the Mafia boss's study. He'd been awake, working at his desk, laptop open, files spread across the mahogany surface. He'd looked up when she appeared in the doorway, disheveled and shaking. Hadn't said a word. Just moved papers off the leather couch near his desk and gestured for her to sit. She'd fallen asleep there, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like smoke and expensive cologne. When she woke, it was morning. And the mafia boss was still at his desk, working as if he'd been there all night, watching, protecting, even in sleep. They didn't talk about it. But the next night, when her ribs ached and sleep wouldn't come, she found herself walking to the mafia boss's study again. And the night after that. Until it became routine. She'd wake, he'd be working, she'd curl up on his couch. And somehow, in the quiet hours before dawn, the fear would fade just enough for her to breathe. But tonight was different. Tonight, when Mira entered the study, the mafia boss wasn't at his desk. He was standing by the window, staring out at the city. His shoulders were tight, his hands clenched at his sides. Something was wrong. "The mafia boss?" Mira asked softly. He didn't turn. "You should go back to bed." "What happened?" Silence. Mira crossed the room, stopped beside him, looked out at the city lights that never truly slept. "Vincent made a move," the mafia boss said finally. Her heart dropped. "Against me? Against someone I care about?" The words hung heavy. Mira turned to look at him. "Who?" "My sister." His voice was flat, empty. "She was in a car accident tonight. Brakes failed. She's alive, but—" He stopped, swallowed. "She's in the hospital." Mira's chest tightened. "Oh, God! The mafia boss, I'm so—" "It wasn't an accident," he interrupted. "The mechanics confirmed it. Someone cut the brake lines." The room went cold. Vincent had gone after the mafia boss's family. Not Mira, not directly, but close enough to send a message. "I can't touch her, but I can hurt you." Mira felt sick. "This is my fault." "No." "Yes. If I hadn't knocked on your door, then you'd be dead." The mafia boss finally turned to face her. His eyes were cold, furious. "And my sister would still have been a target eventually. Vincent's been looking for leverage against me for years. But he used me to find it." "He used himself to find it," the mafia boss corrected. "By coming after you, he showed me what he values, what he's willing to do, and that gives me everything I need to end him." Mira shook her head. "You can't start a war because of me." "I'm not." The mafia boss's voice was calm, final. "I'm ending one that started the moment Vincent decided my family was expendable." He moved past her, toward his desk, pulled out a file, set it in front of her. "What is this?" Mira asked. "Vincent's operation. Everything you gave the federal agent, plus everything I've collected over the last 2 weeks. It's enough to bury him, but only if you're willing to testify." Mira stared at the file. "Testify where?" "Federal court, new prosecutor, someone Vincent doesn't own." Her hands shook. "If I do that, he'll kill me." "Not if he's already dead." The words were so matter-of-fact, so calm, that it took Mira a moment to process them. "You're going to kill him," she whispered. "No," the mafia boss replied. "You are, with this testimony, legally, permanently." Mira looked up at him. "And if I say no?" The mafia boss's expression softened, just slightly. "Then I find another way, and you walk away from all of this." He meant it. Even now, even with his sister in the hospital, even with Vincent's threat hanging over both of them, he was giving her a choice. Mira picked up the file, opened it. Saw years of fraud, extortion, laundering, all meticulously documented, cross-referenced, ready to be presented in court. She'd tried to do this once before, alone, terrified, and it had nearly destroyed her. But now she wasn't alone. "I'll testify," she said. The mafia boss nodded. "Then we start tomorrow." Mira closed the file, looked at him. "Why did you help me, really?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because you knocked on my door at 3 a.m, bleeding, terrified, and you still looked me in the eye and asked for help instead of begging for it." His voice dropped. "No one's done that in a very long time." Mira's throat tightened. "I knocked on the wrong door." The mafia boss smiled then, a real smile, small but genuine. "No," he said quietly, "you didn't." 6 months later, Vincent Calabrese was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. Marco turned state's witness and disappeared into protection. The mafia boss's sister recovered, moved to a different city, started over. And Mira. Mira learned to sleep through the night, learned to walk city streets without looking over her shoulder, learned that safety didn't always mean being alone. She still lived in the mafia boss's apartment, not because she had to, not because she was running, but because somewhere between knocking on the wrong door and testifying in federal court, she'd stopped being afraid of the man who'd opened it. And the mafia boss, who'd built an empire on fear and loyalty, had learned that the most dangerous thing he'd ever protected wasn't territory or power. It was a woman who'd knocked on his door at 3 a.m. and changed everything. Late one night, Mira found the mafia boss on the couch in his study, reading, waiting. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head, sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, opening the door that night. The mafia boss looked at her, his gray eyes soft in the lamplight. "Every day," he said. Her heart dropped. Then he smiled. "Because it took you so long to knock." Mira laughed. The sound surprised her. Light, genuine, unafraid. She leaned against him, felt his arm come around her shoulders, steady, safe, real. "I knocked on the wrong door," she whispered. The mafia boss pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Best mistake you ever made. Some loves are dangerous. This one was worth it."